Well, good morning, soil enthusiasts. I am so excited to be here. And I'm more honored that I get to introduce our first presenter today, Dr. Fred Provenza. I kind of wrestled what I was going to say because there's so much to say when it comes to Dr. Fred Provenza. But we'll start with all of his professional accomplishments. For 35 years, he was a professor and instructor at Utah State University, where he worked in behavioral ecology. And he did some groundbreaking research on how plants and herbivores interact through different behaviors that actually change our entire landscape. And in addition to that, he started the world-renowned Behave Center. He's been an author of countless research work. Obviously, the book that you saw, I highly recommend that. Author of that, guest of multiple podcasts, speakers at conferences across the globe, and all of that's super impressive. But I don't think that really explains who Dr. Provenza is. I was fortunate enough several years ago to get to go to a course called Plant-Herbivore Interaction, which was required for NRCS employees at the time. And I have to say, I wasn't really excited to go. It was in Oklahoma in July. Raise of hands, how many people will be excited to go to Oklahoma in July? I wasn't. Oh, we got one in the back. I wasn't. I had too many things on my plate. I didn't want to leave my family. I was too busy at work. I was too this and I was too that. Insert every excuse you possibly can as to why I didn't go. And I am so grateful I did, because going to that course completely changed my life. And it's not because I learned how plants and herbivores interacted with one another. Although very cool, that wasn't the life-changing moment. What Fred did was he was able to convey through that message these beautiful connections that we make on a daily basis, not just with one another, but through the lands that we live on, through everything that is living around us. And it changed me completely. It actually set me on my own personal journey for personal growth, because it prompted me to want to do more, to be something greater. And I am forever grateful for that, Fred. And as I was thinking about how I was going to introduce him, yesterday I was driving down to Denver and I got stuck behind a United Airline bus. Didn't know that existed, but they do. And on the back, it says connecting people and uniting the world. And that's what Fred's message does. And so it is extremely exciting to have him here at Soil Revolution, because as we're talking about things like soil health and regenerative practices and agriculture, if we don't look at ourselves and our connection to the world and the people around us, we really miss the huge impact that we all have collectively. Right here, right now, we're all together to learn and to take this knowledge and move it forward. You have no idea how sharing this knowledge with others, you are making connections and impact. And so it is so exciting to have you here, Fred. And the other thing that I have to share is that when Fred stands up here, not only is he sharing his immense knowledge that he has gained over the years, he also has some street cred. He worked on a ranch here in Colorado for several years, so he has knowledge of working on the land, being part of the land, providing that knowledge, but he also opens up his heart and his soul. And he just brings such vulnerability that you've not quite heard from other presenters before. So please help me introduce my friend, Fred Provenza, to the stage.
Well, that brings a lot of tears to my eyes, I have to tell you truthfully. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today, and thrilled that Sylvia and her husband Ed can be here with us. And I want to thank the organizing committee as well for all the wonderful work that you do. I was able to share a meal with everyone last night, and it was just wonderful to meet all of you and to meet the other speakers here. So thank you for having me. So I want to talk about food today and our relationship with food. And I want to start with what Sylvia mentioned that we did over the years, this whole idea of the wisdom of the body, that there's a wisdom of the body. And if you think about it, nobody has to tell wild creatures what to do, what to eat, to nourish themselves, to self-medicate when they get sick and so forth, how to reproduce. They know how to do that, and they do it very well. The work that we did with locally adapted herbivores, it's amazing to see their abilities to select from huge arrays. You know, we worked on rangelands that had hundreds of different plant species, and to see them be able to select diets. And prior to the time we did the work, we didn't know too much. How are they doing that? What are they doing? You know, they can select from all these different species that are unique biochemically. Some plant species are nutritious, others are quite toxic, actually. Individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending upon the time of the day, morning versus afternoon, the week, the season, and so forth, and the resources available in the environment. So there are many challenges that these animals are up against that we were all learning about and figuring out. So the question that we were addressing is, how do creatures do this they don't have nutritionists to tell them what they should be eating. They don't have pharmacists to recommend medicines when they get sick. They don't have veterinarians to treat them. So that's what I want to explore here at first. And there are three facets to the wisdom of the body: these flavor feedback relationships, the social cultural facets, and then this wholesome foods. And all this applies equally to human beings as well. So let's start on flavor feedback relationships. And if I were to ask you why you like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me because it tastes good, right? If I ask you why you don't like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me because it tastes bad. And you should be laughing too. I'm not a serious guy on this. And what I want to get you to think about is that, and this was startling to us many, many years ago when we started into this, that palatability is more than a matter of taste. It involves feedback, and this feedback is coming from cells and organ systems. If you think about where food goes, it goes to cells, and cells can only forage on what's in the capillaries. Feedback is how cells and organ systems influence liking for the flavors of food as a function of need. And it's these primary compounds, which the energy, protein, vitamins, minerals, and then secondary compounds, this vast array of compounds that plants produce that come under broad headings like alkaloids, terpenes, phenolics, and so forth. The tens of thousands of compounds that we're learning have such health benefits. So it's those things that are influencing what animals do. How did we come about this? So I'm going to run you through a little experiment really quickly, and then I'm going to show you a video. So the best way we came up to do this was to, in the morning after an overnight fast, to offer an animal of not so nutritious food. I'm going to show you with straw here in this video. And then on odd days, animals in group 1 in this example would get apple-flavored straw for half an hour for a little meal. Animals in group 2 would get maple-flavored straw. Immediately after that, we'd drench them with water. Now that only makes sense if it does it all in relation to what we did on even days. We'd switch the flavors, but now we drench them with a nutrient that we're lacking. We've made them very mildly deficient, not strongly, very mildly deficient. And the idea was, for instance, animals in group 1, if they can discriminate feedback based upon the nutrient, they're going to prefer what? They're going to strongly prefer maple to apple-flavored straw, right? And vice versa. And it was so stunning to us when we saw how strongly animals would respond to that. So let me show you a little video here. And, So here's two groups of sheep. One group has been drenched with the nutrient they're lacking when they ate straw. The other was just drenched with water. And you'll see the difference in their liking for straw. It doesn't take long, right? Even at 8 in the morning or whatever time it is. So the one group loves it and the other group can't figure out what's going on, right? If you think about that, every time I watch that video, that's exactly what the food industry has done with ultra-processed foods to us, the same kind of deal there. And so Dave Berry says, what are calories? He says, calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, and it wasn't on your list, but a member of the plywood family, provided by Mother Nature so we'd have a way to get onion dip into our mouths at parties, has none, huh? So we started with energy when we did our studies. We started with energy because we figured if you can't condition a preference with energy, you're not going to do it with anything else. And then we went to protein, and we went to protein to energy ratios, to minerals, to vitamins, and I won't go over all the details of what we did, but always we were conditioning very strong preferences with feedback. Then we worked on the secondary compounds, and you know, at high doses, everything's a toxin, but at lower doses, all compounds can have nutritional benefits, right? You know, and so that's what we were finding with all these secondary compounds as well, so they can be nutrients or medicines. It gets more complicated, though, as all things are. It's really complex interrelationships between primary and secondary compounds that are influencing what animals do, and I'll try to show you a little bit as we go along with that. So to sum up then, what I'm saying is that these flavor feedback associations involve phytochemicals interacting with cells and organ systems, including the microbiome, in a dynamic network of communication. And then, you know, these relationships, as we know, are mediated by nerves, neurotransmitters, peptides, and hormones, and so forth. That becomes the basis for the wisdom of the body. I want to make a point here. The microbiome is such a popular topic now, and for good reasons, and in ruminant nutrition, it's been the popular topic for 60 years or more. But I want to make a point. It's not just the microbiome that's influencing what we do, and that's illustrated really nicely by people who've had organ transplants. Claire Sylvia's book, A Change of Heart, she makes, and I'd love to tell stories, but I'm going to let it go for the sake of time, because her stories are hilarious. But what her point is that when you get another person's organs, it broadens out your preferences to include foods you never liked before, but that your organ donor likes. That makes sense? You've gotten hearts and lungs, in her case, from a 21-year-old young male put into your body. It totally changes your liking. So it's all the organ systems of the body that are weighing in here. And that brings me then, and this begins early in life, of course, these preferences that we develop, which brings me to the social cultural part of this. And one of the things that was so much fun to study are these natal experiences, and they have such a broad influence on food and habitat, where animals go in the environment. And it's everything from insects to birds to fishes to mammals. Again, I could tell so many stories about these kind of relationships, but bottom line, it's the home field advantage in life. Knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator, learning all the nuance of the environment you're in, that's what happens as a result of these natal experiences. And they have profound influences then on what creatures do throughout life, and they do it for us as well. So we had no trouble to show over and over again with food and habitat, I'm not going to even say a word about habitat selection, how mother's influence has a lifelong effect on those things. It starts in utero. You know, the fetal taste system's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So the flavors of foods mom's eating get into the amniotic fluid, already starts to create a preference for offspring before they even hit the ground. Flavors in mother's milk continue on that theme, and then mother as a model is just huge in terms of her effect. And we used to show all these things at short courses that Sylvia was talking about. We'd have people working through and illustrating that for themselves. Well, what happens then is that these influences influence gene expression, this whole field of epigenetics that's blossoming now. We were studying that before it was a field. We were showing that you get changes in organ systems. The central nervous system changes as a function of experience. Kidneys change, rumen development. All the organ systems are changing as a function of these experiences early in life. when I was working on nourishment, I started reading a lot in the human literature, and those very same things are happening with us, starting in utero, early in life with us, milk, and so forth. Probably the most interesting studies in this regard were done by done 100 years ago, trying to switch myself up here, 100 years ago by this lady here. And what she was doing was offering these children 34 different foods available seasonally in the environment. And what she found was what we were finding too when we were doing studies with sheep and cattle. She said no two children ever selected the same combination of foods, and no child ever selected the same food from day to day, but every child selected a diet that met their needs. Clara Davis, old people, man, I'm trying to think of her name. Clara Davis, sorry. My wife warns me, you're getting too old to do this stuff anyway. Clara Davis, it's amazing. Her work was just 100 years ago. She had these kids given up for adoption, 15 kids, 6 years free choice. The pediatricians that studied those children said they'd never seen a healthier set of children in their lives. So the ability to self-select, she was illustrating that many, many years ago. So she concludes they achieved the goal, but by widely various means, as heaven may presumably be reached by different roads. Then she says, the results leave the selection of foods to be made available to young children in the hands of their elders, where everyone always knew it belongs. Now that was true 100 years or 150 years ago. It's not true today, right? It's no longer true. The choices people learn to make now are so heavily influenced by the food industry, and absolutely nothing is left to chance. I've worked with those people over time. The pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, universities. I'm generalizing here, not everyone, but as a group, work together to help create a pandemic of diet-related diseases whose symptoms, there's a lot of money in symptoms, right? And treating symptoms rather than getting at fundamental causes of what's going on here and dealing with those. And so now we have children that are born with transgenerational metabolic syndrome, right? Mother's influence starts in the womb. And so mothers who gain excessive weight during pregnancy, mothers who become obese, who become diabetic during pregnancy are more likely to have fatter babies with higher incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And all these are being mediated by organs and changes in organ systems within the body. So I think all the time, what price are we paying nowadays when we've ignored our transgenerational linkages to the landscapes that nourish and sustain us? So let me say a little bit more about that with regard to wholesome foods. And Mark Shaxter wrote this book, The Dorito Effect, and it's a great book, The Surprising New Truth About Foods and Flavors. And what he points out in that book is two things happen simultaneously. One, the flavors of meat and produce became bland during the last century. They got bland. At the same time, the food industry learned how to make ultra-processed foods absolutely irresistible. As a result, then, we've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, and we've made junk food all the more desirable. There's an article, I don't usually put these in my presentations, but they're by Prescott et al. That just came out last year that's really stunningly good in terms of all the adverse effects of ultra-processed foods, not only on us physically, mentally, emotionally, our development. They nailed it so strongly in that paper. If you're interested, I highly recommend that. So this whole idea of why have foods become blander? And it ties with what you're all interested in. Resource availability in the environment, moisture, nutrients, water, influences attributes of soil, which influences plant chemistry and diversity. And there have been many review papers written, I'm thinking of two, one in the UK and one in the US, that point out that the phytochemical richness of vegetables, fruits and vegetables, have declined from 10 to 50% from 1950 to 1999. Well, when you lose nutrient richness, the first point I was making is that feedback from nutrients is what makes us like foods. It's those nutrients that do that. When you lose the nutrients, you're going to lose flavor in the foods. And so the varieties we select, the practices we use with irrigating and fertilizing, picking green and shipping, all those can have adverse effects on the flavors of food. So you go to the store, they look absolutely great, but then you offer them to young children. Many studies are done trying to get young children to eat vegetables. They don't want to eat their vegetables. Why? Because there's nothing there that's worthwhile. So phytochemical richness then and flavor depend on the variety and the site where a plant's growing. Bob Quinn, I think, came here a few years ago and spoke, and he talked about the ancient grains and the phytochemical richness of a lot of those ancient grains. What's happened is we've selected so much for yield that we've lost phytochemical richness. There's a corn variety that Sue and I used to love to grow in Utah. It's called bodacious. Absolutely delicious when it was grown on the soils in Utah. When I grew it 2 years ago in Innis, it tasted like field corn. It was absolutely horrible. And of course, what my wife says, she says, "You're old. You probably didn't even select bodacious when you went to the store. You don't know what you're doing." So I went there and we both picked it out last year, grew it again. It has no flavor. It's the conditions it's growing under, right? It's not the variety, it's the conditions. When I was in Mexico years ago, I had tortillas. I was traveling to all these small places 30 years ago or more. And those tortillas were absolutely, I've never had anything like them before or since. The flavor, I couldn't believe that they could be so flavorful. I attribute that to the varieties that they were growing and the conditions under which they grew it. And it was just knock your socks off, the flavor of that. This idea then that I want to transition to the environment where a plant's growing. You know, the other species that are in the environment are influencing the chemical characteristics of the plant. And the Three Sisters is absolutely an example of that. Corn provides structure for beans, which provides nitrogen for corn and squash, which inhibits the spread of weeds. And there's not been a lot of studies done looking at different combinations of vegetables growing together. They did in one study I found on the Three Sisters, and they were more nutritious. Their nutritional content of all of the species had gone up as a result of growing the three in combination. I think that's such a wide open area to try to explore in terms of the outcomes. There was a study published last year on native plant species in Minnesota, long-term studies. And after 23 years, they were looking at mixtures of species versus monocultures. And the plants that were growing with 16 perennial species had 150 to 370% more nutrients in the plant tissues. They also had 30 to 90% more water and nutrient holding carbon in the soil. Amazing kind of differences as a result of growing plants in mixture versus in monoculture. You know, people who study these things, and many folks here know, each plant species harbors a unique rhizosphere community. It's unique to each species. Diverse mixtures of species interact in ways that enhance the soil microbiome, nutrient availability, and plant chemistry. And really nice research is being done to document that. So I like to say all the time that plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for all life below and above ground. And I think nothing is more important for health through nutrition than landscapes with a variety of different plant species for all this different life below and above ground. You know, when I think of the work we did on self-medication in animals, there are really two ways that creatures can self-medicate. One is therapeutically, and so after a hard night on the town, took this outside of my window yesterday at the Holiday Inn. It was by these guys' room. No, No, but what we were able to show is that animals can learn to self-medicate. And I won't go into all the details, but under all these different kinds of conditions, they can learn to, for bloat, for acidosis, for too much tannins in the diet, too much oxalates, for external parasites, internal parasites, and so forth. Animals have the ability to do that. They have to learn it, but they can do it. And it starts with learning from mother as well. But they can also self-medicate prophylactically, that is to say preventatively. And I often think of this, you know, those of us who 50 years ago were really gung-ho to go out and watch what animals were eating, study what they were doing. You're just blown away by how many species they would eat. But we'd always know that like 3 to 5 plants would make up the bulk of the diet. And I didn't think we all focused on the 3 to 5 plants because that was where the nutrition and the growth was coming from. But now what I realized is by eating little amounts of a huge array of different plant species, what are they doing? They're providing their cells and organ systems with this vast array of phytochemicals that they wouldn't get if they were just sticking with 3 to 5. Does that make sense? It's that diverse array in small doses that's doing it. And so, you know, my colleagues in Utah and in New Zealand are showing now health is enhanced when livestock graze phytochemically rich mixes. Oh, many people are studying this nowadays. Here's some studies from in New Zealand, and they show with those 6 plant species, health improves when they graze them. They gain weight more efficiently with less emissions of methane and nitrous oxide because of the tannins that are in those plants in the diet. And they can reach slaughter weight just as quickly as animals on feedlot. There's some really interesting work that's going on nowadays on that. Biochemically diverse diets also enable sequences that complement one another. That is to say, animals can learn that if they eat an appetizer of this plant species, they can eat way more of a plant species that they might not. For instance, endophyte-infected tall fescue is by all rights a fairly toxic plant, high in alkaloids, but it forms the bulk of a diet for animals in the southeast and parts of the eastern United States. What we were showing is that with tannin-containing plants like bird's foot trefoil, if sheep and cattle have maybe a 15-minute meal of trefoil, they can eat far more endophyte-infected tall fescue with no adverse effects on them. Why? The tannins are binding with the alkaloids, rendering them inert. With the same kind of thing has been shown with shrubs. Bitterbrush is high in tannins. When sheep or cattle have an appetizer of bitterbrush, they can eat far more sagebrush and so forth. So these complementarities. And that's what the shepherds in France have figured out. The nuance that goes into the way they move across those landscapes is absolutely stunning. And so they have, when they look across a landscape, there's everything from highly desirable to, if you insist, to disgusting. But what they learn is how to create sequences so that they can utilize everything in the environment. The nuance it's just so impressive to see how they do that. So you have appetizer phases, main courses, booster stages, dessert, and so forth as part of the meals. And what they're doing is not only enhancing performance of the animals, they're maintaining the health and biodiversity of those landscapes. That's one of the key functions is ecological health for all creatures in the environment. So let's move from that quickly then to this idea of plant diversity and chemistry influencing the phytochemical richness of the foods that we eat as well. There were some studies done in Italy several years ago where they were looking at milk and cheese, looking at the phytochemical richness and flavor of milk and cheese if it came from animals that were foraging on diverse landscapes, had many, many plant species, or if the animals were being fed a total mixed ration. And the phytochemical richness, as you would know, is huge when they're foraging on a diverse array of species. It's very low when they're foraging on a total mixed ration in a feedlot. The preference of the Italian people, I don't even have to tell you which they prefer, hands down, right? It's the cheese that's coming from the animals that are eating this diverse mix of plants, because that's improving the health, the quality of the cheese for the people. The same thing is true with meat, and I find this interesting. I heard a comment, I don't know, Ken Burns has a movie, The Buffalo Hunter, that just came out, and there was a lady that made this same comment as Warren Angus Ferris made in this diary, Life in the Rocky Mountains, from 1830 to 1835. He's talking about bison and using bison as the food that sustained them, and he said bison in poor condition were horrible. The meat was horrible. But he said, when bison get into good condition, there's nothing better. There's nothing that you can have that's better. He said, with it, we require no seasoning. Where's the seasoning coming from? We boil, roast, or fry it as we please and live upon it solely without bread or vegetables of any kind. We never tire of or disrelish it. This is the point the lady was making in the Ken Burns movie, which would be the case with almost any other meat after living upon it exclusively for a few days. So that's pretty amazing to me to think about. And he's saying it for bison. I think it can be true for sheep, for goats, for cattle, for any creature when you get down to what's going on here. So I'm a cheerleader anymore for young people, and I'm cheerleading with Stefan Van Vliet. We're doing a lot of studies. Stefan's doing the studies, I'm doing the cheerleading. And we're comparing meat from animals that are in feedlots with meat from animals that are eating phytochemically rich diets. We're doing 3 different kinds of studies. Metabolomics analyses, which is a way to look at the vast array of phytochemicals that get into meat, basically. I won't go more into that. We're also doing feeding trials to look at inflammatory response in the body when people eat meat from different sources. And then we're going to move into clinical trials. And we have another colleague in New Zealand who's running and gunning, doing great kind of work along these lines. So briefly, the metabolomics work. We just published a paper late last year on bison. And we had bison, 2 situations. One, out on rangelands, foraging on these really diverse landscapes. The other were in pens, but they had a choice. They weren't just on total mixed rations. They had a little bit of a choice: meadow hay, alfalfa hay, or corn. They ate a lot of corn as part of this. But what was interesting is that the bison on rangelands had much more phytochemicals in their meat and fat, really rich in that, and in amounts that can be meaningful for us. Very high in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. The bison were under less oxidative stress. One of the things I found most interesting, and Stefan studies human nutrition. He's a human nutrition guy. He said, when you look at those bison finished in the pens, they have early signs of metabolic syndrome. And the reason? Diet and exercise. They don't get to move around much in those pens, right? And look at the diet that they're eating. So that scales up then to us. You know, every time we eat a meal, there's an inflammatory response that occurs within our body, with increasing odds of developing disease when meals that elevate inflammation over and over again become dietary habits. Now, these are typically what people think of as pro-inflammatory. You know the list, and it includes red meat and fat, and I want to make a point on that right here. And we typically think of phytochemically rich herbs, spices, vegetables, and fruits as being anti-inflammatory. Now, if animals are eating diverse arrays of different plant species and all those phytochemicals are getting into the meat, you know where I'm going, right? And this is where there's been so little kind of research done. The only study I know of, until the one that Pablo Gregorini did just recently, and it hasn't been published yet, but it's the same finding, but was done by researchers in Australia, and they were looking at inflammatory response after a meal, and they were feeding people 2 different foods in a crossover design. One was cattle finished in a feedlot. The other was kangaroos foraging out on phytochemically diverse landscapes. And the inflammatory markers just go up, 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 up the minute you eat the meat from cattle in feedlot, and they stay up for hours. The ones from the kangaroo, there's no increase in inflammatory markers at all. So it's the phytochemical richness of those diets that's influencing that, and that's what Pablo found in a study that a clinical study that he's just finished. Well, I wrote to the guys in Australia and I said, man, this is so interesting. Are you going to do it where animal and diet aren't confounded? Are you going to run it, in other words, with cattle so we could see and they said, no, we have no interest in that. Our point is that if you want to eat healthy meat in Australia, you buy kangaroo in the stores, you don't buy beef. And if you've lived in Australia, you know you can purchase it right there. So anyway, now I see a bunch of work is going to get done on that, and I think it's so valuable to do that. With the point being, meat isn't meat, right? Dairy isn't dairy. It depends on where those creatures are coming from, and our health, from plant diversity through the health of soil, through the health of all the creatures on the landscape, including us, is linked intimately with that. So, two spiritual dangers, huh? Two spiritual dangers. I can't believe I'm on time. I've been skipping stories right and left here to try this. They scared me last night, though, at the meal. You know, if you think of our ancestors, our palates were linked so intimately with the landscapes that we inhabited. Ancestors, I think, but we've lost that over time. And so why has human nutrition become so utterly confusing? Unlike wild and domestic creatures that are locally adapted that I've been talking about, we now have to be told by authorities what and what not to eat, right? And if you've lived long at all, you know that advice changes constantly, right? With all that advice, you'd think we'd be horribly fit, but we're horribly unfit, actually. And I'm not trying to be a judge of nutrition. I appreciate it. It's the challenge. You know, trying to do studies and stuff is very, very challenging deal. And in nutrition, it's especially challenging. But, so, the guy says on the scale, and he says, well, it seems your weight is just perfect. You just happen to be 11 feet too short. So all that guidance has only led to confusion, right? And I think what's sad is that we don't appreciate that there is a wisdom to the body, that there's a wisdom, and it's unique to each one of us. Every one of us in this audience is absolutely different, is absolutely unique when you look at our physical and biological and physiological characteristics. No two creatures have ever been alike on this planet. So who's got to figure out what's going to work for their body? I think physically and spiritually as well. We each have to make the journey, right? But whoever tells that, we get all this advice, and here's how it leads. So I'll show you this.
We're so happy to have everyone home for the holidays. Your dad has been cooking all day.
Butter braids, bacon wrap with my famous apple sage stuffing. Who wants one?
None for me, honey. I'm on a diet.
And did you say butter braids? Because I'm dairy-free.
I'm lactose intolerant.
I'm gluten-free. No stuffing for me, honey. I'm off carbs. I don't eat meat anymore, except for fish and chicken, just not turkey.
Is that free range?
Did it die of natural causes?
Was it an assisted suicide? Because that is the most morally delicious. Nothing for her. She's just difficult.
Dig in. Some butter.
Brought to you by Canada's Liquor Corporation. Nothing says Christmas like booze.
Okay, so it's amazing to me how powerful media can be. That's 45 seconds we watched. They made so many points there, right? I could talk about it for an hour and not be nearly as effective as what they've said there. But it was stunning to me when I started to get into the human nutrition to read studies that show the power of what we believe to influence how we behave and what we perceive, what we can actually perceive. For instance, these are each examples. I won't give them all. Just take that meat example there. So they would offer people the very same piece of meat, exactly the same piece of meat. And if they told you that it came from a really diverse pasture and was really raised humanely, you'll say, I like that meat far better than if they tell you this came from a factory farm. But it's the same meat, you see. And I'm not, I do the same thing, right? We all do. Or that milkshake example, they can take the same milkshake and tell you this thing has 10,000 calories and your body's going to respond physiologically as if it does have 10,000. So at a neuromorphophysiological basis, we're responding based upon the baggage that we bring in. We all do that, right? Based upon what we believe. So this challenge then is to how to tap into the wisdom of your own body, how to tap into that. There are studies, and I've been reviewing literature a bunch more than I'm going to give you here on this sort of thing, and I never try to advocate for one diet or another because I think people have to figure that out for themselves. But I think there's a big push for vegan, vegetarian diets. Meat's in the crosshairs, that meat's not necessarily good for human or environmental health, which I don't agree with at all. So there's this push for vegetarian, vegan diets and for animal welfare reasons, and I can understand why people would do that. But some of the studies are really revealing because the way people are behaving is not what their body is telling them. Vegetarians report a lower desire to eat meat compared with omnivores, but their neural activity reveals an inherent craving for meat. To me, these findings highlight the dissonance between acquired beliefs and attitudes and inherent needs for nutrients in meat. There's a twin study just published. I don't know if you read it or not. One of the points they made is the lack of satisfaction with the vegan diet, right? People were not satisfied with that. Why? There's a need for some of the compounds that are in meat. Meat has very readily available nutrients. Plants do as well. That's the reason most of us are omnivorous, right? We can meet our needs best with a combination of those things. So I think then what I'm saying is we've broken our linkages with the landscapes that nourish and sustain our lives. And I want to tell a story. My friend Mary DeLuca, who's 88 years old, was going to try to be here with us. Hopefully she's watching by live stream with her son Jimmy. We've been lifelong friends, and her parents were like parents to my wife and I. Crazy, huh? So in 1969, when I was a senior in high school, I began to work for Henry DeLuca on a ranch west of Salida, Colorado, at the base of Mount Chavanaugh. In this photo here, Henry's 16 in this photo on the left. He's with people who homesteaded all that land in those valleys. Those are the pioneers of that area. Henry's 83 in the photo on the right. So Henry had no formal education at all, but what he had was a lifetime of knowledge working with soils, plants, herbivores, and human beings. His knowledge came to his brain through his hands, and his knowledge had a lifelong influence on me. I can still recall a conversation we had during the summer of my sophomore year in college. I'd taken a class in genetics. I was on time until this point here, right? I'm gonna be I'd taken a class in genetics, and I was learning all these things about heterosis, but I knew that Henry always kept his own replacement heifers. So I asked him, why don't you buy replacements and bring them into the place? And he said, I'd done that in the past. And he said, but let me tell you what happened. And then he reminded me, he said, you know how when we move cattle, during the summer, we'd move them on that Mount Chavanaugh all across that huge country there. from one pasture to another. He said, you know, we know that when they're in this particular pasture, let's say Blanks or whatever it was, we're going to have to go check many of these little places because there's going to be a little group in there and a little group over here, little family groups. He said, when you bring cattle in from outside of this range, you don't know if you're going to find them, you don't know where you're going to find them, and they're not going to be bred. And then he told me what happened to him one year when he had to move his entire cattle herd to a totally unfamiliar environment. He summed that one up by saying that was the summer from hell. Well, he summed up the whole works by saying the basic problem is the cattle just don't know the range. The animals just don't know the range. And when I think back over all the research we did for 50 years, 40, 50 years, every bit of it was that. What does it mean to know the range? What does it mean to be intimately linked with those landscapes, starting in utero, early in life, epigenetically, and going from generation to generation to generation? That's what the wildlife species do. During the first 60 years that Henry was on the ranch, they raised and sold cattle locally. It was only after World War II that the feedlot systems developed and that whole way of being took off. So as we move to greater scales, ever fewer people involved in ranching and farming, we broke our linkages with the landscapes that nourish and sustain us. I've never felt so grounded and centered as I did in those years on the ranch, connected seamlessly with the cycles of life. You know, not unlike various stages of a lifetime, from youth to adulthood to old age and then to the passing. There's a rhythm in temperate regions that draws people into its cadence. The song begins in the spring when plants elevate their shoots to greet the sun, whose presence is increasingly felt warming the landscape's nurturing life. Wild domestic mammals, whose young are no longer bathed in the warmth of mother's womb, are now bathed in the rays of the sun. The tempo picks up in summer as plants fashion leaves, flowers, fruits, and parents educate offspring in the ways of the world. On the ranch, we irrigated, cut, baled, stored hay and grain. We raised big gardens during spring and summer as food for winter. The beat slows in autumn, time for taking stock of what's happened, time for enjoying the colors as deciduous trees of green turn to red, salmons, yellows, and oranges, time for relishing the fall harvest, butchering hogs, making sausages. Winter's a time for recreation, as snow blankets the landscape from the foothills to the tops of the high mountain peaks. New life, already in the wombs of Mother Earth, is awaiting rebirth to this planet. When I was young, people of my grandparents' generations were still in touch with the cycles of life, even if they weren't living on farms and ranches. They grew beautiful gardens. Most of them had chickens. Some even had a hog. They hadn't yet lost those connections with Mother Earth. That happened during my parents' generation, and it's grown ever more pronounced since in my generation and beyond that. So, as Aldo Leopold writes here to start to sum up, there are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace. To avoid the first danger, one should plant a garden, preferably where there's no grocer to confuse the issue. To avoid the second, he should lay a split of good oak on the andirons, preferably where there's no furnace. Let it warm his shins while a February blizzard tosses the trees outside. You know, most of us don't own farms or ranches, but we have yards, right? And you know about this, where that can link us back with wholesome foods and wild plants and animals. There's our place in Innis. We have 1.5 acres. It's a rock pile, literally a rock pile. Never tried to grow anything in worse places. There's the head gardener of the place. And what we've encouraged is native plants throughout that entire place. And it's amazing the number of people who will stop and say, your place is so beautiful. What did you do? And we say, that's what nature does. That's what grows here, the beautiful different plants. We grow herbal, medicinal, and vegetable gardens all throughout the place. We have a greenhouse because it's so cold there to get stuff going. And we got hundreds of different trees and shrubs and stuff. What we're doing is creating life, right? Creating life above and below ground. And in so doing, we reduce our needs for water, the lifeblood of this plant, and fossil fuels to grow, fertilize, weed, and mow lawns. You know, a study by NASA scientists show that there's like 63,000 square miles of lawn in the US. That's the size of Texas. That's a huge amount of land. And when you think we spend each year $30 billion on lawn care, 3 million tons of fertilizers and herbicides and so on and so forth, right? Over 800 million gallons of gasoline. Residential water use is huge, 30 to 60% of total water use, 7 billion to 9 billion. Point is, we could all become farmers, right? We could all become farmers. And probably most important of all, we could start to link ourselves back with the landscapes that nourish and sustain us, right? To actually grow plants and have a few chickens. It's amazing to me when people come to our place and we turn into, they follow from the city and they follow the chickens around for half an hour. It's so calming. It's so nice to follow the chickens, we say. Okay, so we've made an art form of dining, but we've tabled the larger questions. Eating in this sense that's on the ranch that I experienced is participating in endless transformation as plants and animals give their lives to sustain our lives. As I eat energy and matter in someone, these are beings. We know that all animals are sentient and plants are conscious, if not sentient as well. People are making, it's not that one thing is different, they're all. And so you come to see in the sacredness of it all. So this someone becomes this entity I call me, which will in the flicker of a cosmic eye return to earth as plants and animals. In pondering this mystery, we may come to realize that all life is sacred. We're members of nature's communities. What we do to them, we do to ourselves. Only by nourishing them can we nourish ourselves. And I think for me, we do that by declaring love, not war, on one another and the landscapes we inhabit. And with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all of you.
Okay, thank you so much, Fred. That was wonderful. On the pollev.com website, you can put your questions in there. If you wrote one out, just kind of hold the sticky note up and we'll come around and grab them to ask questions for Fred. The other thing I forgot to say was, I forget. It'll come back to me. Yeah, so Fred, I guess I'll start off if we don't have any questions yet. If you were, say, governor of your state, what laws do you think you would want to encourage to get some of the transformations you were talking about here? Or do you think it's more of an individual action?
You know, I never think much. I've never been involved in politics other than voting, and so I don't think too much in terms of laws and so forth and so on. I think surely, and we were talking about incentives, right? How do you incentivize the right kind of behaviors? I think that's so important in people. I've always been more of a bottom-upper than a top-downer, though, and thinking that how do you get people to move, and what each of us do locally. You know, I think of all the people that stop by, and it just meant my wife has zero ego, and she's always blasting me for one thing or another, but I see it in her when people stop and say, your yard is so beautiful, just driving down the road. That influences people, right? Because then they start to think, and you say, well, you know, that can open the conversation. So to me, I've always been bottom up, you know, and that's a good question. I know people would have people in this audience would have good ideas related to laws and regulations. I'm betting better than me.
What advice do you have for folks looking to reconnect to the land, but they live in apartments or have limited financial resources?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think of these community gardens where sometimes people can get together to grow things. I also think of my daughter-in-law who doesn't have much place where she can grow stuff, but she buys different vegetables and stuff and just grows them on her little porch area, you know, where there's a little bit of sunlight. And she talks to her plants all the time, and that may no, it won't sound corny to this group, I can tell, but you know, there gets more and more evidence for how plants have 20 different senses, right? All the things that they're doing. So this relationship with those plants helps to enrich her life, and so that's one way I think that a person could do that.
What single task would you recommend to help improve our soil conditions for maximum nutrient transfer?
You know, I think of plant diversity over and over again, and the value of plant diversity, getting diverse mixtures of different plant species, each with their own rhizospheres, and just creating the diversity then that enables, broadens out the microbiome of the soil, broadens out all the life in the soil, below ground, and then of course above ground as well. So I'm really a fan of biodiversity. And plant diversity, you know, plants are the givers of life, right? They're the givers of life. They nurture life on this planet. So to me, I think starting with plants and the diversity of plants, and I often think too, it was in my sophomore year in college that I took a class in plant taxonomy. And I had never, that was a whole universe that I never even saw. Now I think how many universes don't I even see that are right there in front of me. There's a little creek I used to like to fish there in the Salida area, and when I went back after my sophomore year, I couldn't even walk up that creek. I couldn't even fish. I was just looking at all these plants. It's like I never even saw it. And so how do you open that up to people? I mean, when you start looking at the plants, the flowering plants, the grasses, it's stunningly beautiful, you know, and how we, and I know you're spreading some of that, you know, how do you get people to tune in? And then to realize if you grow that in your, what used to be your Kentucky bluegrass lawn, that's what grows naturally. And you have all these things that happen from spring, the cool season grasses, to summer, to the warm season grasses and forbs and shrubs. And you just watch that, and then you watch all the pollinators and so forth that come to visit your place. It can draw you in then, right? And you become a part, you feel a part of that natural environment, I think. And to me, it's a spiritual thing. It's very spiritual. It's grounding and centering, and it links you with that oneness with being, with it all, to me. So that's what I think about a lot, and think how can you get people to tap into that again for all of our well-beings.
I remembered what I was going to say. Okay, just so you know, these we're being recorded. We will post these recordings to the website. So if you feel like you missed something, the slide went by really fast because we yelled at Fred so much last night. It will be on our website in January, okay? So don't fret. We'll have one more question, and then we'll have our exhibitor intro, so the exhibitors could start to make their way over here. Good food can cost so much. How can we get highly nutritious food to everyone instead of just people who can afford it?
Yeah, that's where I think about some of these programs that you hear about through the federal government and so forth. If you look at the cost to us as a society, good food, it doesn't cost a penny, right? I mean, you look at the medical, where we are nowadays. I have a dear sister who's in bad shape right now, and the cost of that. And the food industry has been so clever about how, when we'd be in these conferences together, we were all talking about the same principles and processes, what I was talking about today, only just take that to more and more levels of detail and nuance. And I used to think, you know, nobody cares really about a sheep or a goat or a cow. Where the money is with people. And when I'd listen to those guys talk about how we were losing market shares on this particular item and what we did, and in those days, I wasn't really seeing the downside of it. I just think, whoa, that was cool. You know, it was really smart. It's bad news, you know, and you just have to get that, yeah. We've got to get eating wholesome foods, all of us eating wholesome foods, and trying to incentivize that. But there's so much money in food, and the ultra-processed and the food industry is how, you know, how do we raise awareness, and how do we get to where we're all eating really wholesome foods and not paying these enormous trillions of dollars costs that we're paying now for medical, pharmaceutical, all of that. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be here.